The train whistle pierced through the Montana morning air as Margaret Sullivan stepped onto the platform at Copper Ridge Station, her white cane tapping against the wooden planks. She had traveled over 2,000 miles based on nothing more than letters and a promise from a man she'd never seen. What she didn't know was that the rancher waiting for her couldn't see her either, and that he was about to recognize something about her voice that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September wind carried the scent of pine and cattle across the small depot as Margaret carefully navigated the unfamiliar platform. Her fingers gripped the handle of her worn leather suitcase, while her cane swept methodically from side to side. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 4 days, and every mile had brought her closer to a future she could barely imagine. "Miss Sullivan." The voice came from her left, deep and weathered, with the slight hesitation of someone choosing words. Carefully, Margaret turned toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Yes, that's me. Mr. Harrison, call me James." His boots scraped against the wooden platform as he approached. "Welcome to Copper Ridge." She extended her hand in the direction of his voice, and after a moment's pause, felt his calloused fingers close around hers. His grip was firm but gentle, the hands of someone who worked the land but understood fragility. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult," James said, and Margaret caught something in his tone, a careful politeness that suggested he was as nervous as she was. "It was long but manageable," she replied, then hesitated. In his letters, James had mentioned he lived alone on his ranch after returning from the war, but he'd never explained exactly why he needed a mail-order bride, or why he'd been willing to accept her despite her blindness. Most men would have withdrawn their offer the moment she'd been honest about her condition. "My wagon's just over here," James said. "Let me take your bag." As they walked, Margaret listened to the sounds around her, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, voices calling out greetings to James from various directions. Copper Ridge was clearly a small town where everyone knew everyone else, which meant her arrival would be noted and discussed. "Town seems friendly," she said, as James helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Most folks are decent enough," he replied, settling beside her. The wagon dipped under his weight, and she could tell he was a large man. "They mind their own business mostly, which suits me fine." The wagon lurched into motion, and Margaret gripped the edge of the seat. She'd grown up in Philadelphia, where the sounds were urban, carriages on cobblestones, factory whistles, the constant hum of city life. Here the silence stretched between scattered sounds, a hawk crying overhead, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the rhythmic clip-clop of their horses' hooves on packed dirt. "How far is your ranch?" Margaret asked. "About 5 miles out." "Of town, the Double Bar H. Been in my family since before I was born." His voice carried pride mixed with something else she couldn't quite identify. "It's not fancy, but it's good land. Runs cattle mostly, some horses." Margaret nodded, trying to picture what he was describing. In her mind, she imagined rolling, hills dotted with animals, perhaps a simple wooden house with a wide porch. She'd grown up in a cramped apartment above her father's tailor shop, where the most space she'd ever had to herself was the tiny room she'd shared with her younger sister, before consumption took her family one by one. "I should tell you," James said, after they'd ridden in silence for several minutes, "I'm not much for talking usually. The war, it changed some things about me." "What kind of things?" Margaret asked gently. A long pause. "I see things differently now, or rather, I don't see them the same way other folks do." Margaret frowned, puzzled by his phrasing, but before she could ask what he meant, James was speaking again. "Your letters mentioned you lost your sight in an accident. How long ago?" 3 years, Margaret said. "There was a fire in our building. I was trying to help my sister get out and a beam fell. When I woke up in the hospital, everything was dark. I'm sorry." "Thank you. It was difficult to adjust. But I've learned to manage. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I know you need someone to help run your household, and despite my limitations, I can do that. I'm sure you can. There was something odd in his voice, almost like he was smiling, though she couldn't be certain. The wagon hit a rut, and Margaret swayed against James's shoulder. He was solid, stable, and she caught the scent of leather and soap and something else, perhaps the lingering smell of wood smoke. It was surprisingly comforting. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "Sure. In your letters you never really explained why you wanted a mail-order bride. Most men your age in a town like this would have local options." James was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if she'd overstepped. Finally, he spoke. "The war left me different, changed. Most of the local women, they look at me and see something that makes them uncomfortable. I figured someone from far away, someone who'd answered my advertisement, knowing I was honest about my situation, might be more understanding." "What situation?" Margaret asked, confused. His letters had mentioned he was a veteran, but hadn't gone into detail about any specific problems. "I'll show you when we get to the ranch," James said. "It's easier than trying to explain." They rode the rest of the way with only occasional conversation. James pointed out landmarks, the creek that marked the edge of his property, the stand of cottonwoods, where he'd built a small cabin for his hired hands, the pasture where he kept his prize breeding stock. Margaret tried to form mental pictures from his descriptions, filing away details that might help her navigate her new home. When the wagon finally stopped, Margaret heard the creaking of leather as James climbed down, then felt his hands at her waist, helping her to the ground. His touch was careful, respectful, and she appreciated that he neither treated her like she was made of glass, nor assumed she couldn't do anything for herself. "This is it," James said. "Home." Margaret stood still, letting her other senses take in information. The house was large. She could tell from the way sounds echoed differently, and she could smell wood smoke from what was probably a substantial fireplace. There were other scents too, hay from a nearby barn, the earthy smell of horses, and something that might have been late blooming flowers. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "My father built it with the intention of filling it with children," James said, and there was sadness in his voice. "That never happened for him and my mother. They both died of influenza when I was 22, just before I left for the war. I'm sorry for your loss." "Long time ago now." James took her arm gently. "Let me show you inside, then I'll get your things." The front door opened with a heavy creak, and Margaret stepped into what felt like a large entryway. The floors were wood, well maintained, and she could hear the echo of their footsteps in what must be a sizable space. "Kitchen's to the right, parlor to the left," James said. "Your room, if you want it separate from mine, is upstairs. There are 4 bedrooms up there. I use the one down here off the kitchen." Margaret felt a flush of relief. She'd been wondering how to approach the sleeping arrangements, given that they were essentially strangers who'd agreed to marry. "I'd prefer my own room for now, if that's all right," she said. "Of course, I figured as much." James guided her through the house, describing the layout of each room. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a cast-iron stove that he'd obviously been maintaining himself. The parlor had a fireplace big enough to heat the entire downstairs, and furniture that felt substantial and well-made under her exploring fingers. Upstairs, he showed her to a room that faced east. "Gets good morning." "Light," he said, then caught himself. It's a pleasant room. Has a good view of the mountains." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, testing its firmness. It was comfortable, and the room smelled clean, like someone had aired it out in preparation for her arrival. "I'll bring up your things," James said from the doorway. "Thank you, James." "Yes. You mentioned that the war changed you, that you see things differently, and you said you'd show me what you meant. I'm still not sure I understand." A long silence. Then, I lost my sight at Antietam. Shrapnel from an exploding shell. I've been blind for 4 years now. Margaret's breath caught. You can't see either. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No, ma'am. I navigate by sound and memory and a fair bit of stubborn pride. I was hoping that someone who understood what it was like might be more patient with my limitations than most folks around here have been. Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions, surprise, understanding, and something that might have been relief. That's why you were willing to accept my blindness. Partly, yes, but also, James paused, there was something about your letters, the way you wrote, the things you said. You seemed like someone who understood that there's more to a person than what you can see on the surface. Margaret stood and moved toward his voice. May I? She asked, raising her hand. After a moment, she felt James take her hand and guide it to his face. Her fingers traced the familiar geography of scars, the roughened skin along his left temple, the slightly misshapen bone around his eye socket, where shrapnel had done its damage. The locals find it unsettling, James said quietly. I find it human, Margaret replied. We all carry our wounds. Yours just happened to be visible. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition that went deeper than their shared disability. Margaret realized that for the first time in years, she was talking to someone who truly understood what it meant to navigate the world without sight, who knew the constant adjustments and calculations that others took for granted. I should let you rest, James said, stepping back. It's been a long journey. We can talk more over dinner. After he left, Margaret sat on the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. She'd come west expecting to marry a rancher who needed help managing his household. Instead, she'd found someone who understood her world in a way no one else ever had, but there was something else, something nagging at the back of her mind. James's voice was familiar in a way that went beyond their correspondence. She'd heard it before, somewhere, though she couldn't place where or when. Downstairs, she could hear James moving around the kitchen, the clatter of pots and the scrape of a chair. The sounds were comforting, domestic, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Margaret allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found not just a home, but something closer to belonging. As evening approached and the sounds from the kitchen grew more purposeful, Margaret realized she was looking forward to dinner, not just for the food, but for the chance to talk more with this man who seemed to understand her in ways she hadn't expected. There were still so many questions, so many things to learn about each other, but first she needed to figure out why his voice seemed so familiar, and why every time he spoke, she felt like she was remembering something important that remained just out of reach. Dinner that first evening was a careful dance of politeness and curiosity. James had prepared a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, apologizing for the limited fare as he guided Margaret to her chair at the kitchen table. I'm not much of a cook, he admitted, settling across from her. Been living on basic meals since I got back. Margaret took a spoonful of the stew and was surprised by its rich flavor. This is quite good, actually. You're being modest. My mother taught me the basics before she died. Said a man should know how to feed himself properly. James's fork clinked against his bowl. Though I'll admit, I've gotten tired of my own cooking these past few years. As they ate, Margaret found herself studying the cadence of his speech, the particular way he shaped certain words. The familiarity tugged at her memory like a half-remembered song. Tell me about your ranch, she said, pushing the nagging feeling aside. How do you manage the cattle without sight? James chuckled, the first genuine humor she'd heard from him. Carefully, and with a lot of help from my horse, Ranger. He's got more sense than most people when it comes to working cattle. I also Have two hired hands, Tom Baker and his son Billy. They've been with me since I got back from the war. That must be challenging, running a business when you can't see the books or oversee everything directly. I've developed systems. Tom reads me the important papers, helps with correspondence. I can't manage myself. I know every inch of this land from childhood, so I can still ride the property boundaries, check on the herds by sound and smell. Animals. Don't care if you can see them or not, they respond to confidence and consistency. Margaret nodded, impressed by his practical approach. In Philadelphia, people assumed I couldn't do anything useful once I lost my sight. It took months to convince my neighbors I could still mend their clothes and help with washing. Folks see the disability before they see the person, James agreed. Gets tiresome after a while. After dinner, James showed Margaret to the back porch, where they sat on wooden chairs, facing what he described as a view of the mountains. The evening air was crisp, carrying sounds Margaret had never heard in the city, the distant call of a night bird, the rustle of wind through tall grass, the occasional lowing of cattle settling for the night. It's peaceful here, Margaret said. Peaceful. And lonely, James replied. That's part of why I wrote to the matrimonial agency. A man gets tired of talking to horses and cattle all day. Margaret laughed. And I was tired of talking to myself in a tiny room above a tailor shop. Though I should warn you, I might not be much better company than your livestock at first. I'm still adjusting to all of this. What was Philadelphia like? James asked. I've never been to a big city. Margaret described the crowded streets, the constant noise, the smell of coal smoke and industry. She told him about her father's tailor shop, how she'd learned to sew by feel, becoming so skilled that customers specifically requested her work on their finest garments. After the fire, after I lost my sight, some people were afraid to let me handle their clothes, she said. They thought I'd ruin them. But Mrs. Patterson, who lived down the hall, stood up for me. Told everyone that my fingers could feel imperfections, that eyes might miss. Sounds like a good friend. She was. Lost her to pneumonia last winter. That's when I started thinking about leaving Philadelphia. Too many memories, and not enough for the future. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds. Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. The vastness of the Montana sky, even unseen, felt different from the cramped confines of city life. "Can I ask you about the war?" Margaret said eventually. James was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his voice was careful, measured. "I was a sergeant in the 5th Pennsylvania Infantry. We saw action at Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Antietam. That last one is where—" He gestured vaguely toward his scarred face. "September 17th, 1862. Bloodiest single day of the war." Margaret had read about Antietam in the newspapers, the staggering casualties, the photographs that had shocked the nation. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." "It's not that I don't want to. It's just that most people ask out of curiosity, not understanding. They want war stories, tales of glory and heroism. The reality was mostly mud and fear and trying to stay alive long enough to see home again." "What happened to your sight?" "Confederate artillery got lucky. Shell landed close to our position, threw up shrapnel like a tornado. Piece of metal took out my left eye completely, damaged the right one badly enough that I lost vision gradually. Over the next few weeks," James's chair creaked as he shifted, "spent months in a military hospital in Washington, then came home to find my parents had died while I was away." "That must have been devastating. Changed everything I thought I knew about my future. Had to learn the ranch all over again, figure out how to do everything differently. Some days I wondered if it wouldn't have been easier to just sell the place and move to town. Why didn't you? This land is all I have left of my family. My grandfather homesteaded here in 1847, built the first cabin with his own hands. My father expanded the herd, built the house we're sitting in now. Selling felt like giving up on all of that. Margaret heard the deep attachment in his voice, the weight of generations of work and dreams. It must mean everything to you. It does. But it's been lonely work these past 4 years. A ranch this size needs a family, needs people who care about it as much as I do. Something in his tone made Margaret's heart skip. Is that what you're hoping for? A family? Eventually, if we suit each other. I know we're practically strangers, and I don't expect anything to happen quickly. But yes, someday I'd like children, someone to pass all this on to. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. She'd given up on the idea of marriage and children after losing her sight, assuming no man would want a wife who couldn't see. The possibility of not just a home, but a real family felt almost too good to hope. For I'd like that too, she said quietly. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of men's voices in the yard below her window. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where she found James at the kitchen table with 2 other men. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Tom Baker and his son Billy," James said, rising as she entered. "Tom, Billy, this is my bride, Margaret Sullivan." "Pleasure to meet you, Ma'am," came a gruff voice that belonged to Tom. "James has told us a lot about you." "Nothing but good things, I hope," Margaret replied, accepting Tom's handshake. "All good, Ma'am. And this here's my boy, Billy." Billy's handshake was enthusiastic, his voice young and eager. "Real nice to meet you, Miss Margaret. Pa says you're from Philadelphia. I've never been to a big city." "It's quite different from here," Margaret said, charmed by the young man's friendliness. Over breakfast, Margaret learned more about the ranch operations. Tom had been working for James's family for over 15 years, starting as a young cowhand and working his way up to foreman. Billy, now 19, had been born and raised on the ranch and knew the land almost as well as James did. "We've got about 300 head of cattle spread across 4 main pastures," Tom explained. "Been having some trouble with rustlers lately, but nothing we can't handle." "Rustlers?" Margaret asked. "Cattle thieves," James clarified. "There's been a gang working the area, hitting smaller ranches mostly. They haven't bothered us yet, but Tom thinks it's only a matter of time. We've increased the night patrols," Billy added, "and James here can hear a cow in distress from half a mile away, better than any guard dog." After Tom and Billy left to start their morning chores, James offered to show Margaret around the immediate area of the house. He took her arm gently and guided her around the yard, describing the layout of the barn, the chicken coop, the vegetable garden his mother had planted years ago. "I've let the garden go wild," James admitted. "Never had much skill with growing. In things that aren't grass for the cattle." Margaret knelt and felt among the overgrown plants, identifying herbs by their scent and texture. "There's still good sage here, and rosemary. This patch feels like it might be onions gone to seed. Think you could bring it back to life?" "I'd like to try. I helped tend a small garden behind our building in Philadelphia. It would be nice to have fresh vegetables and herbs for cooking." As they walked, Margaret continued to be struck by the familiarity of James's voice. It wasn't just his accent or manner of speaking. There was something specific, a particular inflection on certain words that seemed burned into her memory. "James, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Sure. Have you ever been to Philadelphia? Before the war, maybe?" James stopped walking. "No, never. Why do you ask?" "Your voice sounds familiar to me. I keep feeling like I've heard it before, but I can't place where or when." A long pause. Voices can be deceiving. Maybe I just sound like someone you used to know. There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that made Margaret wonder if he was being completely truthful. But before she could pursue the question, they were interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. "That'll be Doc Patterson," James said. "I asked him to come by and meet you." Dr. Patterson turned out to be a jovial man in his 60s who'd been practicing medicine in Copper Ridge since before James was born. He examined both Margaret and James, pronounced them in good health, and stayed for coffee and conversation. "It's good to see James with company," the doctor told Margaret privately, while James was seeing to his horse. "He's been too isolated since he came back from the war. A man needs companionship, especially after what he's been through." "What exactly has he been through?" Margaret asked. "I know about his injuries, but he doesn't talk much about his experiences. James saw some of the worst fighting of the war, lost a lot of good friends at Antietam, witnessed things that would break a lesser man. Coming home blind to find his parents dead, it nearly destroyed him. Took him 2 years to even consider taking over the ranch again." Margaret felt a deeper understanding of the careful way James moved through the world, the occasional shadows that crossed his expression when he thought no one was listening. That afternoon, Margaret insisted on helping with the household chores. She'd brought her own cleaning supplies and sewing kit from Philadelphia, and she set about organizing the kitchen and assessing what needed to be done around the house. "You don't have to do all this right away," James said, finding her scrubbing the cast-iron stove. "I want to contribute," Margaret replied. "Besides, keeping busy helps me adjust to new places." As she worked, Margaret began to feel more at home. The rhythms of ranch life were different from city living, but there was a peace in the routine that she found appealing. James was a considerate companion, answering her questions about where things belonged and how he preferred his household organized. That evening, they sat on the front porch again, and Margaret brought up the subject that had been nagging at her all day. "James, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "All right. Have we met before? Not just through letters, but actually met?" The silence stretched long enough that Margaret knew she'd hit on something important. "Why do you ask?" James said finally. "Because every time you speak, I feel like I'm remembering something important. Your voice isn't just familiar, it's specific, like a song I used to know by heart but can't quite recall." James was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he wouldn't answer. When he did speak, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. "What if I told you that we had met before? What would that mean to you?" Margaret's heart began to race. "Where? When? That's a longer story. And depending on how you react to it, it might change everything between us." "Tell me," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever it is, I need to know." James stood up from his porch chair, his boots heavy on the wooden planks as he paced to the railing. Margaret could hear him gripping the wood, his knuckles probably white with tension. "It was the spring of 1861, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was 23, just enlisted, waiting for my regiment to ship out from Philadelphia. We had 3 days of leave before deployment." Margaret's breath caught. She'd been in Philadelphia in 1861. She'd been 17, working in her father's shop, but she remembered the soldiers flooding the city, the excitement and fear as young men prepared for war. "There was a dance," James continued. "St. Mary's Church was hosting it for the soldiers. I didn't want to go, never was much for dancing, but my friend Tommy Martinez dragged me along, said it might be our last chance to dance with pretty girls for a long time." The memory hit Margaret like a physical blow. St. Mary's Church, spring 1861. She'd attended that dance with her sister Clara, both of them swept up in the patriotic fervor, wanting to send the soldiers off with happy memories. "I was standing by the punch bowl," James said, "trying to work up the courage to ask someone to dance, when this girl bumped into me. She'd been reaching for a cup and her elbow caught my arm. Punch went everywhere, all over my dress uniform." Margaret's hand flew to her throat. She remembered. A tall soldier with kind eyes and a gentle smile, apologizing profusely, even though she'd been the one to spill the punch. She'd been mortified, certain she'd ruined his evening. "She was so embarrassed," James continued, "kept apologizing and trying to clean my jacket with her handkerchief. Had the sweetest voice I'd ever heard, like music. She told me her name was Margaret O'Brien. O'Brien was my maiden name," Margaret whispered. "I took Sullivan from my stepfather after my mother remarried." James turned back toward her, though neither could see the other's face. "You spent 20 minutes helping me clean that punch stain, talking the whole time. You told me about working in your father's tailor shop, how you could mend anything. You were worried you'd gotten me in trouble with my commanding officer." The details came flooding back. The handsome soldier who'd been so gracious about her clumsiness, who'd made her feel like the most important person in the room despite her accident. They'd talked for what felt like hours. "We danced," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You said you weren't good at it, but you were. You held me like I was made of porcelain. 3 dances, a waltz, a polka, and another waltz. You laughed when I stepped on your dress during the polka, said it gave the dress character." Margaret remembered his laugh, the way it had made her stomach flutter. She'd been smitten with this soldier boy who treated her with such gentle respect. "You walked me home," she said. "It was late, and you were worried about me traveling alone. Through the city. Your father's shop was on Carpenter Street. You lived in the apartment above it with your parents and your sister Clara. You pointed out the window of your room, said you'd pray for my safety every night." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now. "You gave me your handkerchief, said to keep it until you came back from the war. Do you still have it?" Margaret's hand went instinctively to her chest, where beneath her dress she wore a small locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside that locket, carefully folded, was a white cotton handkerchief with the initials J.H. embroidered in blue thread. "Yes," she whispered. James's breathing was shaky. "I looked for you when we shipped out. Came by the shop, but it was closed. A neighbor said your family had moved suddenly. Your father had gotten work at a factory in another part of the city. Papa lost 3 big accounts that week. We had to move to a cheaper place near the river. I wanted to find you, to say goodbye properly, but I didn't even know your last name. You'd only told me James. James Harrison, 5th Pennsylvania Infantry, Company B." Margaret stood up, her legs unsteady. "I read the casualty lists in the newspapers religiously. Every battle, every skirmish. I was looking for James from 5th Pennsylvania, but there were so many. Without knowing your surname." "I wrote you letters," James said quietly. "Dozens of them, but I didn't know your new address, and letters to Carpenter Street came back marked, 'Moved, no forwarding address.' I wrote to you too, sent them to the 5th Pennsylvania care of the War Department. I never got a reply." They stood there in the darkness, separated by only a few feet, but bridged by 4 years of longing and loss and the impossible coincidence that had brought them back together. "When I got your first letter through the matrimonial agency," James said, "when you signed it Margaret Sullivan from Philadelphia, something stirred in my memory. But I told myself I was being foolish. What were the chances?" "Your handwriting," Margaret said suddenly. "In your letters to me as my intended husband, it was different from what I remembered. Shakier. I lost fine motor control in my hands, along with my sight. Nerve damage from the shrapnel. I have to concentrate hard to write legibly now." Margaret moved toward his voice, her hands extended. When she found him, she placed her palms flat against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her touch. "You came back to me," she whispered. "We came back to each other," James corrected, his arms coming up to encircle her, "against all odds, across all these years and miles." Margaret leaned into his embrace, breathing in the scent of him, older now, weathered by war and hardship, but still fundamentally the same man who'd held her so carefully on a dance floor 4 years ago. "I dreamed about you," she admitted, "especially after I lost my sight. I'd dream about that night, about dancing with someone who made me feel safe and cherished. I thought I'd made you up, romanticized a simple evening into something more meaningful than it was. You didn't romanticize anything? That night changed my life. In all the worst moments of the war, when I thought I might not survive, I held onto the memory of dancing with a girl who made me believe in goodness and beauty. They held each other as the Montana night settled around them, both crying now, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of finding each other again. "The matrimonial agency," Margaret said eventually. "How did you know to specify Philadelphia in your advertisement?" "I didn't, not consciously. But when I decided to look for a wife, something kept drawing me back to that city. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was fate." "I almost didn't answer your ad. I'd gotten 3 other responses that week, all from men who seemed interested only in what I could do for them. But your letter was different. You wrote about loneliness and understanding, about building something meaningful together. Because I was writing to the girl I'd met that night, even if I didn't fully realize it. Everything I said about wanting a partner who understood hardship, who could see beyond surface appearances, I was describing you." James pulled back slightly, his hands coming up to frame her face. His thumbs traced the tracks of her tears. "Margaret O'Brien," he said softly. "My Irish rose. You called me that at the dance. I'd forgotten until just now. Your hair smelled like roses. You said it was soap your mother made." Margaret laughed through her tears. "Mama's rose soap. She taught me the recipe before she died. I still make it." "Some things come full circle," James said. "We were meant to find each other again." The next morning brought a different quality to their interactions. The careful politeness between strangers had been replaced by something deeper, a sense of destiny fulfilled, of pieces of their lives finally clicking into place. Margaret woke with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. The questions that had nagged at her about James's familiar voice were answered, but more than that, the lonely ache she'd carried since losing her family had eased. She wasn't just starting over in Montana, she was reclaiming a love story that war and circumstance had interrupted. At breakfast, James reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to do this right," he said. "I know we're already engaged to be married, but that was between strangers. I want to ask you properly now, as the woman I fell in love with 4 years ago." Margaret's heart swelled. "Ask me what?" "Margaret O'Brien Sullivan, will you marry me? Not because we made an arrangement through letters, but because you're the only woman I've ever loved, and I want to spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost." "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "Yes, James Harrison, I'll marry you." They were kissing when Tom Baker's voice came from the kitchen doorway. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom said, and Margaret could hear the grin in his voice. "Looks like things are working out better than expected," James laughed, not releasing Margaret from his embrace. "Tom, we have some news. Margaret and I knew each other before the war. We're not strangers after all." "I figured something was different this morning," Tom said. "Both of you look like you swallowed sunshine. Billy owes me $5. I bet him you two would be smitten inside a week." "You bet on us?" Margaret asked, amused. "Ma'am, in a town this size, romance is about the only entertainment we get. And watching James mope around here for 4 years, we all knew he needed someone special." Billy arrived for breakfast shortly after, and his delight at the news was infectious. He peppered them with questions about their first meeting, declared it the most romantic story he'd ever heard, and immediately began planning improvements to the house for what he called proper newlyweds. "We should have a real wedding," Billy announced. "Not just a quick ceremony with the justice of the peace. The whole town should celebrate." "I don't need a big wedding," Margaret protested, but James squeezed her hand. "Maybe we should consider it," he said. "After everything we've been through to find each other again, it seems worth celebrating properly." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, several of them moving fast. Tom's expression grew serious as he moved to the window. "James, we got trouble coming." 6 riders, armed, moving toward the house like they owned the place. James stood immediately, his relaxed demeanor shifting to alertness. The rustlers. Could be. Billy, get your rifle. Margaret, you might want to step away from the windows. Margaret felt James's hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the back of the kitchen. What's happening? Probably nothing serious, James said, but she could hear the tension in his voice. Just some men who don't understand that they're not welcome here. The riders pulled up in the yard, their horses snorting and stamping. Margaret could hear leather creaking, spurs jingling, and the low murmur of men discussing strategy. Harrison. A voice called out, rough and commanding. We need to talk. James moved toward the front door, Tom and Billy flanking him. Margaret followed, staying behind them but close enough to hear everything. You're on private property, James called back, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded soldiers in battle. State your business or move on. Name's Buck Crawford. Maybe you heard of me. Margaret felt James tense. Clearly he had heard the name and it wasn't good news. I know who you are, James replied. You're not welcome on my land. Now, that's not very neighborly, especially when I come bearing an offer that could benefit us both. Crawford's voice was getting closer, suggesting he'd dismounted and was approaching the house. Margaret could hear the subtle sounds of Tom and Billy checking. They're weapons. I'm not interested in any offers from you, Crawford. Maybe you should hear me out before you go making hasty decisions. I hear you got yourself a new wife. Pretty little thing from back east. Shame if something were to happen to her while she's still adjusting to life out here. The threat was clear, and Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. This was exactly the kind of danger she'd never faced in Philadelphia, the lawless reality of frontier life that her comfortable city existence hadn't prepared her for. James's voice, when he spoke, was deadly quiet. If you're threatening my wife, Crawford, you should know that I may be blind, but I'm still a very good shot. And I have friends who see perfectly well. No need for threats, Harrison. I'm just saying that accidents happen out here. Cattle go missing, fences get cut, sometimes houses catch fire. All very unfortunate, especially for folks who don't understand how things work in this territory. Margaret realized she was witnessing the collision of her new life with forces she didn't understand, threats that could destroy the happiness she'd just rediscovered. But she also saw something else, James transforming from the gentleman she'd fallen in love with into the soldier he'd been, ready to protect what was his. You have 30 seconds to get off my property, James said. Then I start shooting. Crawford laughed, but it sounded forced. You can't bluff forever, Harrison. Think about my offer. I'll be in touch. The sound of retreating horses filled the morning air, but Margaret knew this wasn't over. Whatever Crawford wanted, whoever he was, he'd made it clear that their newfound happiness had painted a target on their backs. After Crawford and his men disappeared over the ridge, an uneasy silence settled over the ranch. Tom stationed himself by the front window while Billy took up watch from the barn loft. James guided Margaret to the kitchen, where he poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Who is Buck Crawford?" Margaret asked, settling into her chair. "The worst kind of trouble," James replied grimly. "He runs a gang of cattle thieves, claim jumpers, and general outlaws. They've been working their way through smaller ranches, either buying them out for pennies on the dollar or driving the owners off through intimidation." "What kind of offer do you think he was talking about?" "Probably wants to buy my land cheap, or maybe cut some kind of deal where I look the other way while his men run stolen cattle through my property." James set down his cup harder than necessary. "Neither option is acceptable." Tom joined them, his weathered face grim. "James, we need to talk about protection. Crawford's got at least a dozen men, maybe more. If he decides to make serious trouble, we'll handle it," James said firmly. "With respect, 3 men and a blind rancher against Crawford's gang isn't exactly favorable odds." Margaret bristled at Tom's casual dismissal of James's capabilities. "My husband served with distinction in the war. His blindness doesn't make him helpless. No offense meant, ma'am, Tom said quickly. James is tougher than most men with full sight, but Crawford doesn't fight fair. He'll come at night, use tactics that put civilians at risk. Margaret felt a chill of fear, not just for herself, but for James and the life they were trying to build together. What are our options? We could send word to the territorial marshal, Billy suggested, joining them from his watchpost. Get some official law enforcement involved. James shook his head. Nearest marshal is 3 days' ride away, and Crawford would be long gone by the time help arrived. Besides, we don't have proof he's done anything illegal yet. Threatening us isn't illegal, Margaret asked. His exact words were carefully chosen, Tom said. Talked about accidents and unfortunate events. Never made direct threats. A smart lawyer could argue he was just making conversation about the dangers of frontier life. Margaret realized how naive she'd been about the realities of their situation. In Philadelphia, there had been police, courts, civilized ways of handling disputes. Here, justice seemed to depend on who was stronger or more ruthless. So what do we do? She asked. We stay alert, stick together, and make it clear that trying to intimidate us will cost more than Crawford wants to pay, James said. Most bullies back down when they realize their target is going to fight back. Over the next few days, an armed vigilance settled over the ranch. Tom and Billy took turns on watch duty, and James insisted on accompanying Margaret whenever she left the immediate vicinity of the house. The easy domesticity they'd begun to establish was replaced by constant awareness of potential danger. Margaret tried to maintain normalcy by focusing on wedding preparations. She'd written to Dr. Patterson's wife, asking for help arranging a ceremony at the local church. Mrs. Patterson had responded enthusiastically, organizing a reception and inviting what seemed like half the territory. I didn't realize we were going to have such a large wedding, Margaret said, reading the latest letter from Mrs. Patterson about the guest list. News travels fast in small communities, James replied. People are curious about you, and they're happy to have an excuse for a celebration. Are you sure you want all this fuss? We could still have a quiet ceremony. James took her hands in his. Margaret, I lost you once because of circumstances beyond our control. This time, I want everyone to know you're my wife, that you belong. Hear that anyone who threatens you answers to me and this entire community. Margaret understood the deeper meaning. A public wedding would establish her place in the community, create connections that could provide protection if Crawford escalated his intimidation tactics. The wedding dress proved to be a challenge. Margaret had brought her finest dress from Philadelphia, but it was more suitable for city life than a frontier celebration. Mrs. Patterson offered to help alter it, but when she arrived at the ranch, she had a different suggestion. My dear, I have something that might be perfect, she said, unwrapping a bundle of ivory silk. This was my wedding dress, made in San Francisco in 1848. I've been saving it for my daughter, but she eloped last year and wore her husband's mother's dress instead. Margaret ran her fingers over the luxurious fabric, feeling the delicate lace trim and tiny pearl buttons. Mrs. Patterson, this is beautiful, but I couldn't possibly— Nonsense. It would make me happy to see it worn by someone who appreciates it. Besides, we're nearly the same size, and the style is timeless. With Mrs. Patterson's help, Margaret tried on the dress. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The silk rustled softly as she moved, and the lace overlay caught the light beautifully. You look radiant, Mrs. Patterson declared. James is going to be speechless. 2 days before the wedding, their vigilant peace was shattered. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Too many horses, moving too fast. She dropped the wet shirt she'd been holding and ran toward the house, calling for James. He met her at the back door, rifle in hand. How many? I don't know. More than before. Tom and Billy appeared from the barn, armed and ready. This time Crawford hadn't come to talk. Harrison! Crawford's voice boomed across the yard. Time's up for considering my generous offer. James stepped onto the back porch, Margaret beside him despite his attempts to get her to stay inside. I already gave you my answer, Crawford. Maybe your pretty wife will be more reasonable. Lady, you might want to convince your husband to see sense before he gets you both killed. Margaret felt anger flare hot in her chest. Mr. Crawford, my husband and I have made our position clear. This is our land, and you're not welcome on it. Crawford's laughter was ugly. Feisty little blind mouse, aren't you? Let me paint you a picture of what's going to happen if you don't cooperate. No need for pictures, James interrupted, his voice carrying the cold authority of command. Tom, Billy, take positions. Margaret, get inside. I'm staying with you, Margaret said firmly. You heard about what happened to the Morrison place last week? Crawford called out. Terrible fire. Lost everything. House, barn, livestock. Old. Morrison and his wife barely escaped with their lives. Margaret felt ice in her stomach. The Morrisons had been mentioned in church as needing help after losing their ranch to a mysterious fire. That was you, James said. Proves how dangerous it can be out here for folks who don't understand the local customs. Now I'm going to make this real simple. You sell me this ranch for a fair price, or you might find yourself facing similar unfortunate accidents. The answer is still no. Then you're a fool, Harrison, and fools don't live long on the frontier. The sound of gunfire erupted suddenly, not from Crawford's men, but from the direction of the main road. Shouts and the pounding of more horses suggested that reinforcements had arrived, but Margaret couldn't tell if they were friend or foe. What's happening? She asked, but James was already moving, pushing her toward the house. Federal marshals, a new voice shouted. Drop your weapons and surrender. The next few minutes were chaos. Crawford's men scattered, some trying to escape, others taking defensive positions behind wagons and outbuildings. Margaret crouched behind the kitchen table, heart pounding, as gunfire echoed around the ranch. When the shooting stopped, an authoritative voice called out, "This is Marshal William, Hayes Territorial Law Enforcement. All parties lay down weapons and come out with hands visible." James set his rifle aside and helped Margaret to her feet. Together, they walked outside to find the yard filled with federal marshals and several of Crawford's gang in custody. Crawford himself sat on his horse, hands bound behind his back, his face a mask of fury. Marshal Hayes was a tall, lean man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. He tipped his hat to Margaret before addressing James. "Mr. Harrison, I apologize for the disturbance. We've been tracking Crawford's gang for weeks. When we heard they were threatening law-abiding citizens in this area, we decided to make our move." "How did you know to come here?" James asked. "Your friend Dr. Patterson sent word to our office in Helena after he heard about Crawford's visit. Said you might need assistance dealing with organized criminals." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for the doctor's foresight. Community connections had indeed provided the protection James had hoped for. "What happens now?" she asked. "Crawford and his men will stand trial for cattle rustling, arson, and intimidation. We have enough evidence to put them away for a very long time," Marshal Hayes replied. "You folks can go back to living your lives without looking over your shoulders." As the marshals prepared to leave with their prisoners, Crawford fixed his hate-filled gaze on James and Margaret. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I have friends, and they don't forget." "Your friends will be too busy running for their lives to worry about us," Marshal Hayes said calmly, spurring his horse forward. After the dust settled, and the last of the law enforcement contingent disappeared over the horizon, an exhausted quiet fell over the ranch. Margaret sank into a porch chair, suddenly aware of how tense she'd been for days. "Is it really over?" she asked. "This part is," James said, settling beside her. "There might be other challenges ahead, but Crawford won't be one of them." Tom and Billy joined them on the porch, both looking relieved but alert. "We should still be careful for a while," Tom said. "Crawford might have been bluffing about friends, but it's better to be cautious." "Agreed," James said. "But I think we Can proceed with the wedding as planned. The wedding. Margaret had almost forgotten about it in the midst of the crisis. Now the idea of celebrating their love publicly seemed even more important. A declaration that they wouldn't be intimidated, that they were building something lasting and beautiful despite the dangers of frontier life. 2 more days, she said, smiling for the first time since Crawford's arrival. 2 more days, James agreed, taking her hand. And then you'll officially be Mrs. Harrison. I've been waiting 4 years for that, Margaret said. We both have. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains, in shades of gold and purple, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She'd arrived in Montana as a lonely woman seeking security and companionship. Instead, she'd found her first love, faced down dangerous criminals, and discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. James? Yes? Do you think we would have found each other eventually, even without the matrimonial agency? Do you think fate would have brought us together somehow? James considered the question seriously. I'd like to think so, but I'm grateful we didn't have to wait any longer to find out. Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling completely safe for the first time since Crawford's initial visit. Tomorrow, they would finalize wedding preparations. The day after that, she would marry the man she'd fallen in love with at a soldier's dance 4 years ago, the man who'd carried her memory through war and blindness and loneliness. I love you, James Harrison, she said quietly. I love you too, Margaret O'Brien Sullivan, soon to be Harrison. In the distance, cattle lowed peacefully in their pastures, and nightbirds called from the cottonwoods by the creek. The sounds of their new life together, finally free from the shadows of the past and the threats of men like Crawford. Their wedding day was going to be perfect. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of Margaret's bedroom. She woke to the sound of wagons arriving in the yard below, neighbors bringing food, decorations, and good wishes for the celebration. Mrs. Patterson arrived early with her daughter-in-law, Sarah, and 2 other women from town. They bustled around Margaret's room, transforming it into a bridal preparation chamber, complete with hot water for bathing, rose-scented soap, and the ivory silk wedding dress hanging like a promise from the wardrobe door. Such a romantic story. Sarah Patterson gushed as she helped Margaret wash her hair, meeting at a dance before the war, losing each other, then finding love again through the mail. It's like something from a novel. Better than a novel, added Mrs. Fletcher, the blacksmith's wife. Real love that survived real hardship. Margaret submitted to their ministrations, grateful for the female companionship she'd missed during her solitary years in Philadelphia. These women were welcoming her not just as James's bride, but as a new member of their tight-knit community. Downstairs, she could hear male voices as the men set up tables and benches in the yard. James's laughter rang out occasionally, and the sound made her heart flutter the same way it had 4 years ago at the soldiers' dance. You're glowing, Mrs. Patterson observed as she helped Margaret into the wedding dress. Happiness suits you, dear. Margaret felt the truth of those words. Despite the challenges of recent days, despite adjusting to blindness and frontier life, she felt more alive than she had in years. Love, she realized, wasn't just about finding someone to share your life with. It was about becoming the best version of yourself through that sharing. A knock at the bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret, James's voice came from the hallway. May I speak with you for a moment? The women exchanged amused glances. It's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, Mrs. Fletcher called out. I won't look, James promised. I just need to give her something. Margaret approached the door, opening it just wide enough to extend her hand. James pressed something small and metallic into her palm. A ring, she realized, with intricate engravings she could feel under her fingertip. It was my grandmother's. James said softly. She came west with my grandfather in 1847, started this ranch with nothing but determination and love. I want you to wear it today, to connect you to the history of this place and this family. The ring fit perfectly on her right hand, and Margaret felt the weight of tradition and belonging it represented. Thank you, it's beautiful. There's something else, James continued. I have a confession to make. Margaret's heart skipped. What kind of confession? I kept something from that night we danced, something I never mentioned in my letters. Through the partially open door, Margaret could hear the smile in his voice. What did you keep? A lock of your hair. When we were saying goodbye outside your father's shop, a strand caught on my uniform button. I carefully freed it and kept it all through the war. It's pressed in my Bible upstairs, Margaret laughed, delighted by this romantic secret. You kept my hair for 4 years. It was all I had of you. During the worst battles, when I thought I might not survive, I'd touch that page of my Bible and remember dancing with an angel. Tears threatened to ruin Mrs. Patterson's careful work with powder and rouge. James Harrison, you're going to make me cry before we even get to the church. Save the tears for the ceremony, he said. I'll see you at the altar, my Irish rose. The church was packed when Margaret arrived in Dr. Patterson's decorated carriage. The entire community seemed to have turned out for the wedding, along with visitors from neighboring ranches and even some travelers who'd heard about the celebration and decided to stay for the festivities. Tom Baker met her at the church steps, offering his arm to escort her down the aisle. James asked me to walk with you, if that's all right. Said, since your father couldn't be here, he wanted someone who cared about you both to do the honors. Margaret accepted gratefully, touched by James's thoughtfulness. As they entered the church, the congregation rose, and she heard the collective intake of breath that suggested her appearance had made an impression. The walk down the aisle felt eternal and instantaneous simultaneously. Margaret focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on not tripping over the unfamiliar dress, on breathing steadily despite her racing heart. But mostly, she focused on James's voice as he spoke quietly to Pastor Williams at the altar, the familiar cadence that had brought them back together. When she reached the front of the church, Tom placed her hand in James's, and everything else faded away. The crowd, the ceremony, even her nervousness, all of it became background to the simple reality of standing beside the man she loved. Dearly beloved, Pastor Williams began, we are gathered here today to witness the union of James Harrison and Margaret Sullivan in holy matrimony. The words washed over Margaret like music, traditional vows that countless couples had spoken, but which felt unique and profound when she and James spoke them to each other. Do you, James Harrison, take Margaret to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, James said firmly, his voice carrying across the silent church. Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take James to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Margaret thought about everything that had brought them to this moment, the war that had separated them, the blindness they both carried, the dangerous men they'd faced together, the miracle of finding each other again across time and distance. I do, she said, her voice clear and strong. James slipped his grandmother's wedding band onto her finger, beside the engagement ring he'd given her the day before. The gold felt warm against her skin, a tangible symbol of the promises they were making. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride. James's hands came up to frame. Her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she'd been shedding. When his lips met hers, the church erupted in cheers and applause. But Margaret heard only her own heartbeat, and James whispered, "I love you," against her mouth. The reception that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by the women of Copper Ridge. Roasted beef, fresh bread, preserves, pies, and a 3-layer cake that Mrs. Fletcher had decorated with real roses from her garden. A fiddle player struck up a waltz, and James immediately claimed Margaret for the first dance. As they moved together on the makeshift dance floor in the churchyard, Margaret was transported back to that evening in Philadelphia when they'd first held each other. "Much better than the last time we danced," James murmured in her ear. "How so?" "This time I get to take you home with me." Other couples joined them on the dance floor, and Margaret found herself passed from partner to partner as the men of the community each claimed a dance with the bride. Dr. Patterson was courtly and old-fashioned. Tom Baker was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, and young Billy Baker was so enthusiastic he nearly lifted her off her feet during a particularly energetic polka. But it was the women's conversations that truly welcomed Margaret into the community. They shared advice about dealing with Montana winters, offered to teach her their family recipes, and made plans for quilting bees and church socials where she could contribute her skills. "We haven't had a new bride in town for over 2 years," explained Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband ran the general store. "You've given us all an excuse to dust off our party manners." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret realized she was experiencing something she'd never had before, the sense of belonging to a place and a people. In Philadelphia, she'd been just another resident of a crowded city. Here, she was Margaret Harrison, James's wife, a valued member of a community that had embraced her completely. The celebration continued well into the evening, with stories and songs and toasts to the happy couple. Marshall Hayes, who had returned to ensure there were no further troubles from Crawford's associates, raised his glass with a particularly touching tribute. "To James and Margaret Harrison," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "May your love be as enduring as the mountains that surround us, and may your happiness be as boundless as the Montana sky." As the guests finally began to drift away, hitching their horses to wagons and calling out final congratulations, Margaret and James found themselves alone on the church steps, still in their wedding finery, watching the last of the departing vehicles disappear into the darkness. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Harrison?" James asked, his arm around her waist. "Like coming home," Margaret replied. "Like finding the missing piece of myself I didn't even know was lost." They rode home in comfortable silence, both exhausted by the excitement of the day, but reluctant to let it end. The ranch house looked different somehow when they arrived. Not just the place where Margaret had been staying, but truly home now. That they were married. James helped her down from the wagon and surprised her by sweeping her up in his arms. "What are you doing?" Margaret laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," James said. "Some traditions are worth keeping." Inside, the house felt transformed by their new status as husband and wife. The careful politeness of their first days together had evolved into something deeper and more natural. A partnership built on understanding, shared experience, and genuine love. "I have something for you," Margaret said as they stood in the front hallway. "A wedding gift." She retrieved a small package from the parlor table, something she'd been working on secretly during the past week. Inside was a hand-embroidered handkerchief, made from the finest linen she'd brought from Philadelphia. "Feel the corner," she instructed. James's fingers found the embroidered initials, J.H. and M.H., intertwined with delicate roses. "To replace the one you gave me 4 years ago," Margaret explained, "though I'm keeping that one forever." "It's perfect," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you. Just like this day." They stood there holding each other in the dim light of the front hall, two people who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges, certainly, but also full of promise. "Do you think we'll be happy?" Margaret asked. "I think we already are," James replied. "Everything else is just details." Later, as they sat on their front porch in the moonlight, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd left Philadelphia as a lonely woman, seeking security and companionship. She'd found so much more: a love story that had survived war and separation, a community that had embraced her as family, and a future filled with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. "Listen," James said softly. Margaret tilted her head, taking in the night sounds of their ranch, cattle settling for the night, the distant call of an owl, wind through the cottonwoods by the creek. But underneath it all, she heard something new: the sound of home, of belonging, of a life built on love and shared dreams. "I hear it," she whispered. "I hear everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to build the life they both wanted." But tonight, Margaret Harrison sat beside her husband on the porch of their home, complete and happy in ways she'd never thought possible. The mail-order bride who had arrived blind and uncertain had become a woman who could see her future clearly, at last, and it was more beautiful than she'd ever dared to dream. 3 months into their marriage, Margaret woke to the sound of her husband's labored breathing. James was sitting on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands, shoulders rigid with tension. She'd learned to recognize the signs of his nightmares: the restless tossing, the muttered words in his sleep, the way he'd wake, gasping as if surfacing from deep water. "The dream again?" she asked softly, placing her hand on his back. James nodded, still catching his breath. "Antietam. Sometimes I'm back there hearing the artillery, smelling the smoke. Tonight was different, though. In the dream, I could see again, and I was watching Crawford's men coming for you." Margaret moved closer, wrapping her arms around him from behind. These episodes had become less frequent since their wedding, but they still came, usually triggered by stress or the approaching anniversary of a significant battle. "I'm safe," she murmured against his shoulder. "We're both safe." "I know that up here," James tapped his temple, "but my heart takes longer to convince." The vulnerability in his voice made Margaret's chest tighten. Her strong, capable husband carried wounds that went deeper than the physical scars from shrapnel. She'd learned that healing came in layers, and some hurts took longer to mend than others. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted the quiet moment. James tensed immediately, and Margaret felt her own pulse quicken. Visitors at dawn rarely brought good news. "Mr. Harrison," Billy Baker's voice called from outside. "We need you at the south pasture." James was already reaching for his clothes. "What's wrong?" he called back. "Wolves got into the herd. We've lost at least 6 head, maybe more." Margaret dressed quickly as James grabbed his rifle and headed downstairs. She followed, knowing he'd need her help organizing whatever response the situation required. In the kitchen, Billy was pacing frantically, his young face pale with worry. "Pa sent me to get you as soon as we found the carnage. Never seen anything like it. Looks like a whole pack came through." "How many wolves?" James asked, checking his ammunition. "Hard to say in the dark, but the tracks suggest at least 5. Or 6. Big ones, too. Tom thinks they might be the same pack that hit the Rodriguez place last month." Margaret poured coffee for all of them, her mind already working through the implications. Wolves were a constant threat to ranchers, but organized. Pack attacks were rare and dangerous. If the same wolves were hitting multiple ranches, they'd grown bold and clever, a deadly combination. "Where's Tom now?" James asked. "Still at the pasture with the surviving cattle. He sent me to get you and ask if you want to organize a hunting party." James nodded grimly. "Margaret, I need you to ride into town and spread the word. If this pack is as organized as it sounds, every rancher in the area needs to know." "I'll come with you instead," Margaret said. "You'll need someone to help track and—" "No." James's voice was firm but gentle. "These wolves have already proven. They're dangerous and unpredictable. I won't risk you getting hurt." Margaret felt a flare of frustration. Since their marriage, James had become increasingly protective, sometimes to the point of treating her like she was made of glass. She understood his fears, especially after the nightmares about Crawford, but she was stronger than he gave her. "Credit for, I can help," she insisted. "I know these lands almost as well as you do now, and my hearing might pick up things others miss. Margaret, James Harrison, I didn't marry you to be locked away like a China doll every time there's danger. We're partners, remember?" Billy cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe I should wait outside while you two discuss this." "No need," James said, though Margaret could hear the tension in his voice. "Margaret will ride to town, and I'll meet Tom at the pasture." After Billy left, Margaret and James faced each other across the kitchen table. The disagreement hung between them like a wall, their first real marital conflict. "I'm trying to protect you," James said quietly. "I know. But you're also trying to control me. There's a difference." James was silent for a long moment, and Margaret could almost hear him thinking, weighing her words against his instincts. "You're right," he said finally. "I'm sorry. The nightmares, the worry about other threats. I've been treating you like you're fragile when you're actually one of the strongest people I know." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "I understand why you're worried, but we're stronger together than apart. Let me help you with this, all right? But we do this carefully, and if I say we retreat, we retreat. Agreed? Agreed." By the time they reached the south pasture, the sun was painting the eastern mountains in shades of pink and gold. The scene that greeted them was grim. Several cattle carcasses scattered across the field, the survivors huddled together in obvious distress. Tom met them at the fence line, his face grave. "It's worse than I thought. 7 dead, and at least 3 more wounded badly enough that we might lose them too." Margaret dismounted and followed the sound of Tom's voice, letting her other senses take in information about the attack. The metallic smell of blood hung heavy in the morning air, mixed with the scent of fear sweat from the surviving animals. "Show me the tracks," James said. Tom led them to a muddy section near the creek where the wolf prints were clearly visible. Margaret knelt beside James as he felt the impressions with his fingers, measuring size and depth. "These are big wolves," James said grimly. "Probably over 100 pounds each. And look at this." He guided Margaret's hand to a particular set of tracks. "See how deep these are. This animal is injured, favoring its left front paw." "Injured wolves are the most dangerous kind," Tom observed. "They get desperate, take bigger risks." Margaret stood and walked slowly around the area, listening to the sounds around her. Something was bothering her, a detail that didn't fit the picture they were building. "James," she said suddenly, "come listen to this." She led him to a cluster of tracks near a fallen log. "Feel here and here. These prints are different." James ran his hands over the impressions, his expression growing puzzled. "These aren't wolf tracks. They're dog tracks. Large dogs. Dogs running with wolves," Tom asked, confused. "Or dogs trained to kill livestock and make it look like a wolf attack," Margaret said grimly. The implications hit all 3 of them simultaneously. If these weren't wild wolves but trained dogs, then someone was deliberately targeting the local ranchers, someone who wanted to create fear and economic hardship. "Crawford," James said, his voice hard with anger. "But Crawford's in prison," Tom protested. "His men aren't, and he made it clear he had friends who didn't forget grudges." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She'd thought they were safe from human threats, that they only had to worry about the natural dangers of frontier life. The idea that someone was using trained animals to terrorize their community was more disturbing than simple wolf attacks. "We need to track these animals," James said. "Find out where they're coming from." Following the mixed trail of wolf and dog tracks proved challenging but not impossible. The pack had moved north from the pasture, heading toward the rocky hills that bordered the Harrison property. Margaret rode between James and Tom, using her acute hearing to pick up sounds that might indicate they were getting close to their quarry. After 2 hours of careful tracking, they crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a narrow canyon. Below them, in a natural amphitheater of stone, was a camp that made Margaret's blood run cold. 4 large dogs lay chained near a makeshift shelter, their muzzles stained with blood. But more disturbing were the 2 men tending them, rough-looking. Characters who were clearly not local ranchers, friends of Crawford's, Tom whispered grimly. Using trained dogs to simulate wolf attacks, James added. Probably hitting different ranches to create panic and drive down property values. Margaret listened to the voices drifting up from the camp below. The men were discussing their next target, arguing about whether to hit the Peterson Ranch or the Fletcher place next. "We need help," she whispered. "There are only 3 of us, and those dogs are trained killers." James nodded. "Tom, can you get back to town and bring the marshal? Margaret and I will keep watch, make sure they don't move to another location." "I don't like leaving you 2 alone with those killers," Tom said. "We'll be careful, but we can't let them escape to continue terrorizing other families." After Tom left, Margaret and James settled into a concealed position where they could observe the camp while remaining hidden. The waiting was tense, made worse by the knowledge that the men below were planning attacks on their friends and neighbors. "Margaret," James said quietly after they'd been watching for an hour, "I want you to know something." "What?" "Seeing you handle yourself today, thinking clearly under pressure, helping solve this mystery, it reminds me why I fell in love with you in the first place." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. "Just today?" "Every day. But especially today. You're not just my wife, you're my partner in every sense of the word." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Marshal Hayes appeared with Tom and 6 other men from town, all armed and ready for action. The arrest of Crawford's associates went smoothly, the men surrendering without a fight when faced with overwhelming odds. The dogs were more challenging. They'd been trained to be vicious and had to be handled carefully to avoid injuries. "This explains the pattern of attacks across 3 counties, Marshal Hayes said as his men secured the prisoners. "These men have been working their way through rural areas, using the dogs to create chaos and fear." "What happens to the dogs?" Margaret asked, watching the chained animals with a mixture of pity and wariness. "We'll have to put them down," the marshal said regretfully. "They've been trained to kill livestock and can't be restrained safely." Margaret felt sad for the animals, who were victims of human cruelty as much as the cattle they'd been taught to attack. But she understood the necessity. These dogs represented a continuing threat that couldn't be ignored. The ride back to the ranch was subdued, everyone processing the events of the day. Margaret found herself thinking about the larger implications of what they'd discovered. How many other communities might be dealing with similar attacks? She asked James as they approached their house. "Probably more than we know. This kind of operation takes time and planning. Crawford's people have likely been working on this scheme for months." That evening, as they sat on their front porch, watching the sunset, Margaret reflected on how much their relationship had grown through the day's challenges. The morning's disagreement about her safety had evolved into a deeper understanding of their partnership. "I'm proud of you today," James said, taking her hand. "For what?" "For standing up to me when I was being overprotective. For insisting on being part of the solution. For seeing details that Tom and I missed." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We make a good team." "The best team," James agreed. A week later, news arrived that Crawford himself had been found dead in his prison cell, apparently killed by fellow inmates who disapproved of his methods. His network of associates was being systematically rounded up by federal marshals, bringing an end to the reign of terror that had plagued the territory. "It's really over now," Margaret said when James shared the news. "This chapter is over," James corrected. "There will always be new challenges, new threats to face, but we'll face them together." Margaret nodded, understanding the truth of his words. Frontier life would never be completely safe or predictable, but she'd learned that she was stronger than she'd known, that love could survive and even thrive in the face of danger, and that she'd found not just a husband, but a true partner in James Harrison. As winter approached and they prepared for their first Christmas as husband and wife, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. She'd traveled west seeking security and found something far more valuable, a love that had been tested by separation, danger, and conflict, and had emerged stronger for the testing. The mail-order bride who had arrived blind and uncertain had become a woman who could see her future clearly, and it was filled with love, partnership, and the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, she and James would meet them together. 6 months after their wedding, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, mornings when she couldn't face the smell of coffee, an unusual fatigue that rest didn't cure, and a tenderness that made her suspect what her missed monthly cycle confirmed. She sat in the kitchen that morning, hands pressed to her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy and terror. A baby. She and James were going to have a baby. The sound of his boots on the front porch interrupted her thoughts. He'd been out since dawn checking the cattle with Tom, and she could hear the exhaustion in his step. The spring calving season was always demanding, but this year had brought complications, difficult births, late storms, and a bout of illness that had swept through part of the herd. "Margaret," James called as he entered, "you feeling all right? You've been quiet this morning." She heard the concern in his voice. James had become attuned to her moods and patterns in a way that sometimes startled her with its accuracy. "I'm fine," she said, then reconsidered. "Actually, I have something to tell you, something important." James settled into the chair across from her, and she could sense his full attention focusing on her. "What is it?" "I'm going to have a baby." The silence stretched so long that Margaret began to worry about his reaction. When James finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "A baby? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be, without seeing. A doctor, all the signs are there." "When?" Margaret calculated quickly. "I think sometime in November, maybe early December." She heard James push back from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Then his arms were around her, lifting her from her seat, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh despite her nervousness. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "A son or daughter." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," James replied, his hands moving to rest gently on her stomach. "Terrified, thrilled, grateful, all at the same time." Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling some of her own fears ease at his obvious joy. They talked about children in abstract terms, but the reality of pregnancy made everything more immediate and real. "We should see Dr. Patterson," James said. "Make sure everything is progressing normally." "I was thinking the same thing." "And, James, I'd like to wait before we tell anyone else. At least until we're sure everything is all right." "Of course, though Tom's already noticed you haven't been eating much at breakfast. He asked me yesterday if you were feeling poorly." Margaret smiled. "Tom notices everything. It's probably impossible to keep secrets on a ranch this size." Dr. Patterson confirmed what Margaret already knew, pronouncing her healthy and the pregnancy progressing normally. He also provided practical advice about diet, rest, and what to expect in the coming months. "First babies often come late," he warned as he packed up his medical bag. "Don't be surprised if you're still waiting come Christmas." "What about her work around the ranch?" James asked. "Should she be limiting her activities?" "Margaret can continue most of her normal activities for now," Dr. Patterson said. "Pregnancy isn't an illness, and staying active is actually beneficial. Just use common sense. No heavy lifting, no riding unfamiliar horses, and rest when you're tired." After the doctor left, Margaret and James sat in their parlor discussing the changes that would come with a baby. The spare bedroom upstairs would make a good nursery, James said. It gets good morning light and it's close to our room. We'll need a cradle, baby clothes, all sorts of things I haven't thought about yet, Margaret added, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the list of preparations ahead. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that several women in town would be happy to help with the sewing and advice, and my mother's things are still in the attic. There might be baby clothes and furniture we can use. The idea of using items that had belonged to James's mother touched Margaret deeply. It would connect their child to the family history of the ranch, creating continuity across generations. As her pregnancy progressed, Margaret found herself experiencing the frontier in new ways, her heightened senses, already acute due to her blindness, became even more sensitive. She could smell weather changes hours before they arrived, hear the distress calls of animals from remarkable distances, and detect subtle changes in the household rhythms that indicated someone was unwell. This enhanced awareness proved valuable when a crisis struck in early summer. Margaret was in the garden, harvesting vegetables for dinner, when she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of a horse running at full gallop, but with an irregular gait that suggested its rider was hurt or unconscious. She dropped her basket and ran toward the house, calling for James. He emerged from the barn where he'd been working on harness repairs. "What's wrong?" he asked, hearing the urgency in her voice. "Someone's coming fast from the east, but something's wrong. The horse is running erratically." James listened for a moment, then nodded grimly. "I hear it now. Get inside and stay there." But Margaret had already recognized something in the rhythm of the approaching hoofbeats. "That's Billy's horse," she said. "Something's happened to Billy." They ran toward the sound together, reaching the front yard just as Billy's horse careened into view. The young man was slumped over his saddle, blood visible on his shirt, barely conscious. James caught the horse's bridle, while Margaret helped steady Billy as he slid from the saddle. The young man was pale and weak, a bullet wound in his shoulder, bleeding steadily. "What happened?" James demanded as they helped Billy toward the house. "Rustlers," Billy gasped. "Real ones this time. Hit the north pasture about an hour ago. Pa sent me to get help, but they saw me leaving. One of them took a shot." Margaret's mind raced as they got Billy inside, and she began tending to his wound. If cattle rustlers were operating in broad daylight and willing to shoot anyone who interfered, the situation was more serious than anything they'd faced since Crawford's gang. "How many cattle did they take?" James asked as Margaret cleaned and bandaged Billy's shoulder. "Maybe 50 head. But that's not the worst part." Billy's voice was tight with pain and worry. "They've got Pa. Took him prisoner when he tried to stop them." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. Tom Baker had been like family to them, and the idea of him in the hands of ruthless criminals was terrifying. "Did you recognize any of them?" James asked. "No, but they weren't locals. Spoke with accents, maybe Mexican or Indian. Professional rustlers, not just opportunists." James was already moving toward his gun cabinet. "Margaret, I need you to ride to town and get Marshal Hayes. Tell him we have an organized rustling operation. And they've taken a hostage." "I'm coming with you," Margaret said firmly. "Absolutely not. You're pregnant, and these men have already shown they'll shoot anyone who gets in their way." Margaret felt the familiar frustration of being protected, against her will, but this time it was complicated by the reality of the child she carried. Her first instinct was to argue, but she realized James was right. She couldn't risk the baby, no matter how much she wanted to help rescue Tom. "All right," she said reluctantly, "but promise me you won't do anything foolish. Tom wouldn't want you getting killed trying to rescue him." "I promise. I'll track them, keep them in sight, but I won't engage until we have backup." Margaret rode to town faster than she'd ever traveled alone, pushing her horse to its limits while trying to stay safely in the saddle. Every minute that passed was a minute Tom remained in danger, and she knew that rustlers who took hostages rarely let them live once they'd served their purpose. Marshal Hayes was in his office when she arrived, and he immediately grasped the seriousness of the situation. Organized rustlers operating in daylight suggests they're part of a larger gang, he said as he gathered his weapons and called for deputies. They probably have a planned route to move the stolen cattle quickly, across territorial boundaries. What about Tom? Margaret asked. What are his chances? The marshal's expression was grim. Depends on whether they think he's useful. If they need a guide or information about other ranches, they might keep him alive. If not, he didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. Tom's survival depended on his captors believing he had value beyond his knowledge of where they'd stolen the cattle. The rescue party that rode out from town included Marshal Hayes, 3 deputies, Dr. Patterson, and several armed volunteers from nearby ranches. Margaret wanted desperately to join them, but she forced herself to return home to care for Billy and wait for news. The waiting was agony. Billy had developed a fever from his wound, requiring constant attention, but Margaret's mind was with James and the others as they tracked the rustlers across dangerous territory. Every sound from outside made her heart race, hoping for news of their return. It was nearly midnight when she finally heard horses approaching the ranch. Margaret left Billy sleeping and went to the front porch, where she found James dismounting. Slowly, exhaustion evident in every movement. "Tom?" she asked, afraid to hear the answer. "Alive," James said, and Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. "Shot in the leg and roughed up, but alive. Dr. Patterson is with him now." What happened? James sank into a porch chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "We tracked them to a box canyon about 20 miles north. They'd made camp, probably planning to rest before moving the cattle further. Tom was tied up but conscious. How did you get him out?" "Marshal Hayes had a plan. We waited until most of them were asleep, then created a distraction on one side of the camp, while 2 deputies went in from the other side. In the confusion, we managed to get Tom out and arrest 3 of the rustlers. 3? How many were there? 5 total. 2 escaped with about half the stolen cattle. But we recovered most of the herd and broke up their operation." Margaret sat beside her husband, taking his hand in hers. "You kept your promise. You didn't do anything foolish." "I wanted to," James admitted. "When I saw Tom tied up, hurt, I wanted to charge in with guns blazing. But I thought about you, about our baby, about what would happen to our family if I got myself killed playing hero. You did the right thing. Tom is safe. Most of the cattle are recovered, and you came home to us." James pulled her close, his arms careful around her expanding waist. "How are you feeling? All this stress can't be good for the baby." "I'm fine. We're fine. But I was terrified something would happen to you." "I'm not going anywhere," James promised. "We have too much to live for now." The next few weeks brought a gradual return to normal ranch routine. Tom recovered from his injuries, though he walked with a slight limp that would probably be permanent. Billy's shoulder healed cleanly, leaving him with a scar he wore with the pride of someone who'd been tested and proven brave. As summer progressed into autumn, Margaret's pregnancy became obvious to everyone. The women of the community rallied around her with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and offers to help when the time came. "First babies are always an adventure," Mrs. Patterson told her during one visit. "But you're strong, and you have a husband who adores you. That's more than many women can say." Margaret felt the truth of those words as she watched James prepare for fatherhood. He'd started talking to her belly in the evenings, telling their unborn child about the ranch, the cattle, the life they were building together. He'd also begun working on a cradle in his spare time, carving intricate patterns by feel, creating something beautiful and lasting for their baby. "What if I'm not a good mother?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat on their porch, her hands resting on her rounded stomach. "You'll be wonderful," James said confidently. "You're kind, patient, intelligent and loving. Our child will be lucky to have you." What if my blindness makes it harder to care for a baby? What if I miss something important? James took her hands in his. Margaret, you notice things that sighted people miss completely. You'll hear changes in the baby's breathing, sense when something's wrong, respond to needs that others might overlook. Your blindness isn't a disability when it comes to motherhood. It's just a different way of experiencing the world. Margaret felt some of her fears ease at his words. She'd been worried about the practical aspects of caring for an infant without sight, but James was right. Her other senses were finely tuned, and maternal instinct didn't depend on vision. As October turned to November and her due date approached, Margaret found herself caught between anticipation and nervousness. Soon she would hold her child, the baby she and James had created together, the next generation of Harrisons to call this ranch home. Standing in the nursery they'd prepared, surrounded by the cradle James had made, the clothes donated by neighbors, and the family heirlooms retrieved from the attic, Margaret felt the profound weight of the moment approaching. She was about to become not just a wife, but a mother, adding another layer to the identity she'd built since arriving in Montana as a mail-order bride. The woman who had traveled west seeking security had found love, partnership, community, and now the promise of new life. Her journey was far from over, but she faced the future with confidence, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with James by her side and their child in her arms. December arrived with an early blizzard that transformed the Montana landscape into a world of white silence. Margaret, now heavily pregnant and past her due date, moved carefully through the house, one hand always resting on furniture or walls for balance. The baby seemed determined to arrive on its own schedule, despite Dr. Patterson's predictions. Any day now had become James's morning greeting, said with a mixture of excitement and barely concealed anxiety. He'd taken to staying closer to the house, assigning Tom and Billy to handle the more distant ranch work while he remained within earshot of his wife. Margaret was kneading bread dough when the first contraction hit her like a lightning bolt. She gripped the edge of the kitchen table, breathing hard, waiting for the pain to pass. When it did, she tried to convince herself it was false labor, something Dr. Patterson had warned her about. But 20 minutes later, another contraction came, stronger this time. And another 20 minutes after that. "James," she called, her voice steady, despite the growing certainty that their baby had finally decided to make its entrance into the world. He appeared in the kitchen doorway so quickly that she knew he'd been hovering nearby, listening for exactly this call. "Is it time?" he asked. "I think so. The pains are regular now, coming every 20 minutes. James was already moving toward the door. "I'll get Dr. Patterson." "The storm," Margaret reminded him. Snow was falling heavily outside, and the wind was picking up strength. "I'll make it through. Tom can stay with you until I get back." Margaret caught his arm as he passed. "Be careful. I need you to come back to me." "Nothing in this world could keep me away," James promised, kissing her forehead before heading into the storm. Tom Baker arrived within minutes, bringing practical frontier experience with birthing cattle and horses, though he admitted this was his first time helping with a human baby. His presence was comforting, steady, reliable, unflappable in the face of crisis. "How far apart are the pains now?" he asked, settling into a kitchen chair where he could keep an eye on Margaret. "Still about 20 minutes, but they're getting stronger. That's normal, from what my wife told me before she passed. First babies take their time." Margaret appreciated his calm, matter-of-fact tone. Tom had a way of treating extraordinary events as routine business, which helped keep her own anxiety in check. As the afternoon wore on, the contractions came closer together and with greater intensity. Margaret found herself pacing the house, unable to sit still, instinctively moving in ways that seemed to ease the pain. Tom followed at a respectful distance, ready to help, but giving her space to cope in her own way. "Where are they?" Margaret asked during a brief respite between contractions. James and Dr. Patterson should have returned hours ago. "Storm's getting worse," Tom said. Though his voice carried concern he was trying to hide. "Probably having to take their time getting through the drifts." Margaret nodded, but privately she was beginning to worry. What if the doctor couldn't make it through the storm? What if something had happened to James on the treacherous roads? As if summoned by her fears, another contraction hit with such force that Margaret cried out, gripping the back of a chair until her knuckles went white. When it passed, she realized something had changed. The baby was coming, whether the doctor was there or not. "Tom," she said, her voice tight with urgency, "I think we're going to have to do this ourselves." Tom's face went pale. "Ma'am, I've helped with plenty of calves and foals, but I don't know nothing about delivering babies." "Neither do I," Margaret admitted, "but this baby isn't going to wait for us to figure it out." Another contraction, stronger still, made the decision for them. Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was about to give birth, and Tom was going to have to help her whether he felt qualified or not. "What do you need me to do?" Tom asked, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "Help me get to the bedroom. We need clean sheets, hot water and towels. Dr. Patterson left some supplies when he examined me last week. They're in the dresser drawer." Moving through the house during contractions was challenging, but Tom supported her weight and helped her navigate the stairs. By the time they reached the bedroom, Margaret's water had broken, and she knew the baby would arrive within the hour. "Tom, I need you to listen carefully," Margaret said during a brief break between contractions. "This is going to be frightening, but we can do this. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most of them without doctors." "Yes, ma'am. Just tell me what to do." The next hour was the most intense experience of Margaret's life. Pain unlike anything she'd ever felt, followed by brief moments of rest, then pain again, building to a crescendo that made her feel like her body was being torn apart. Through it all, Tom stayed with her, following her instructions, offering encouragement, and somehow maintaining his calm presence. "I can see the head," Tom said suddenly, wonder and relief in his voice. "The baby's coming." Margaret bore down with everything she had, and suddenly the pain changed, becoming purposeful instead of overwhelming. One more push, and she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It's a girl," Tom announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A perfect little girl." Margaret felt the warm weight of her daughter placed on her chest, and tears streamed down her face as she held the tiny body against her heart. The baby's cries were strong and healthy, and Margaret could feel the tiny fists waving in the air. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm your mama." Tom helped clean the baby and wrap her in a soft blanket while Margaret delivered the afterbirth. Despite the unconventional circumstances, everything had gone smoothly, and both mother and daughter were healthy. "She's beautiful," Tom said softly. "Got her daddy's strong chin and her mama's delicate features. James is going to be over the moon." As if summoned by Tom's words, the sound of stamping feet and male voices came from downstairs. James and Dr. Patterson had finally arrived, fighting their way through the worst blizzard in years. "Margaret!" James's voice called from the bottom of the stairs. "Come meet your daughter," Margaret called back, unable to keep the joy from her voice. The sound of James taking the stairs 3 at a time was followed by his appearance in the bedroom doorway, snow still clinging to his coat, his face flushed with cold and anxiety. Are you?" he began, then stopped as he saw Margaret sitting up in bed, holding their baby. "We're both fine," Margaret said, smiling through her tears. Tom delivered her perfectly. James crossed the room in 2 strides, sinking onto the bed beside his wife and daughter. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the baby's tiny face. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Dr. Patterson examined both Margaret and the baby, pronouncing them healthy and praising Tom's skill as an impromptu midwife. "You did everything exactly right," he told Tom. "Most trained doctors couldn't have done better." Tom flushed with pride at the praise, but Margaret could see he was also relieved to turn the medical responsibilities over to someone with actual training. Over the next few days, as the storm passed and normal life resumed, Margaret adjusted to motherhood with a mix of wonder and exhaustion. The baby, whom they named Rose after Margaret's favorite flower, was a good sleeper but demanded frequent feeding. James proved to be a devoted father, taking on nighttime diaper changes and walking the floors with Rose when she was fussy. His blindness, which Margaret had worried might make caring for an infant difficult, turned out to be no obstacle at all. He could soothe Rose with his voice, detect changes in her breathing that indicated she was about to wake up, and navigate the nursery in complete darkness better than Margaret could. "She knows your voice already," Margaret observed one evening as James sang softly to Rose. "Look how she turns toward you when you speak." "She knows both our voices," James replied. "She's been listening to us for months." The community's response to Rose's birth was overwhelming. Neighbors brought food, baby clothes, and advice. Mrs. Patterson organized a rotation of women to help with household chores. Even Marshall Hayes stopped by with a tiny wooden rattle he'd carved himself. "First babies are special," he said, watching Rose sleep in her father's arms. "But babies born in blizzards with only a ranch foreman for a midwife, those babies are destined for great things." As winter gradually gave way to spring, Margaret reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been a lonely widow in Philadelphia, convinced her life held no more possibilities for love or family. Now she was a wife, mother, an integral part of a frontier community. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked one evening, as they sat on their porch, Rose sleeping in Margaret's arms, while they listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. "Regret what?" "Leaving Philadelphia, coming west, marrying a stranger who turned out to be someone from your past." Margaret considered the question seriously. "I regret the years we lost, the time we spent apart, not knowing we were both alive and searching for each other. But regret coming here? Never. Even with all the dangers. Crawford's threats, the rustlers, having a baby during a blizzard with no doctor, especially because of those things," Margaret said firmly. "They proved that we can handle whatever life throws at us, that we're stronger together than either of us could be alone." James reached over to stroke Rose's soft hair. "What do you think her life will be like, growing up out here, with parents who can't see the world the way others do?" "I think she'll see the world more clearly than most people," Margaret replied. "She'll learn to listen with her heart, to judge people by their character instead of their appearance, to find beauty in things that others might overlook. She'll know she's loved," James added. "That's the most important thing." As if responding to her parents' voices, Rose stirred in Margaret's arms, making the small, contented sounds that babies make when they feel safe and cared for. Looking toward the future, Margaret could envision Rose growing up on the ranch, learning to ride horses, helping with the cattle, playing with the children of neighbors who would become lifelong friends. She would attend the local school, perhaps travel to larger cities for education, but always know that she had a home here in Montana, a place where she belonged completely. "I want to tell her the story," Margaret said suddenly. "What story?" "Our story. How we met at a dance during the war, lost each other and found each other again against impossible odds. How love can survive separation and hardship and still grow stronger." "She'll probably get tired of hearing it," James said with a smile. "Good stories bear repeating, and this is a very good story." James took Margaret's free hand in his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "The best story, and it's not over yet." Margaret leaned against her husband's shoulder, their daughter warm and secure in her arms, and felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The mail-order bride who had arrived blind and uncertain had become a woman who could see her life clearly, and it was more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. In the distance, cattle moved peacefully through the pastures, and the mountains stood eternal against the Montana sky. This was home, not just a place, but a feeling, a certainty, a love that had survived everything the world could throw at it and emerged victorious. Rose stirred again, opening her eyes for a moment to look up at her parents before drifting back to sleep. In that brief gaze, Margaret saw the future, bright, promising, filled with the kind of love that creates legends and builds legacies. Their story would continue through Rose and the children who might come after her, through seasons and years and all the challenges and joys that lay ahead. But this moment, this perfect evening with her husband and daughter, was the foundation upon which all the rest would be built. Margaret Harrison, formerly Margaret O'Brien Sullivan, formerly a lonely mail-order bride, smiled into the gathering dusk and held her family close. She had found her place in the world, and it was more wonderful than she had ever dreamed possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.